Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. This is episode 7 of the Best Enemy Money Can Buy. Conclusions. Treason. Technology cannot be kept from the Soviets by endless paperwork requirements. Americans who ship crucial weapons, and documents to them are criminals. Criminals are glad to sign papers. George Gilder, New York Times. Are these businessmen, the deaf, mute, blind men, internationalists, also guilty of treason? It is interesting to initially look at this question from the viewpoint of the other side, the Soviet side. Avraham Shifrin, a former Soviet defense official, has a blunt conclusion. Shifrin calls the transfers treason, and they, the businessmen, should be shot. To take another example from the other side, the Marxist rebels in El Salvador, the Farambundo Marti Nacional Liberation Front, receive aid from the Soviet Union. At the same time, they claim that our aid to the elected Salvadorian government makes our military advisors in El Salvador legitimate targets for assassination, i.e., the U.S. is an enemy just by virtue of economic subsidy. In brief, the other side interprets aid, even with no technological component, as equivalent to treason. In the original version of this book, National Suicide Military Aid to the Soviet Union, published in 1974, we declined to term subsidies to the Soviets as treason because the vital element of intent was missing. This conclusion was phrased as follows. Do the actions described in this book, National Suicide, constitute adhering to these enemies, giving them aid and comfort? The actions do not legally constitute treason. The Constitution defines the term strictly. For the intention of the framers, with good reason, was to deny Congress the right to interpret treason too freely. Moreover, the body of relevant case law is not substantial. The Kramer and Haupt cases after World War I suggest that both intent to commit treason and overt treasonable acts are required in addition to thorough proof. While the actions described here could be interpreted as giving immediate aid and comfort to the Soviet Union, there is no specific evidence of intent, and intent is a vital requirement. Idiocy, inefficiency, intellectual myopia, and so on do not suggest intent. We need to pose the question again, given the accumulating evidence the last 11 years. Does this sequence of events and actions fall within the meaning of treason? Specifically, does military aid to the Soviet Union constitute adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, as defined in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution of the United States? Are the Soviets enemies? The Soviets have always been explicit about their intentions, so is Hitler and Mein Kampf. Objective truth has no place in communist morality by their own statements. Any statement that will advance the cause of world communism is regarded as truthful, acceptable, and perfectly normal. As far back as 1919, Zinoviev put it well in a statement that applies to the Viet Cong and the Sandinistas as much as to the revolutionary Bolsheviks. We are willing to sign an unfavorable peace. It would only mean we would put no trust whatever in the piece of paper we should sign. We should use the breathing space so obtained in order to gather our strength. This moral dogma, moral only in Marxist ideology, was emphasized by Joseph Stalin. Words have no relations to actions. Otherwise, what kind of diplomacy is it? Words are one thing, actions another. Good words are a match for concealment of bad deeds. Sincere diplomacy is no more possible than dry water or wooden iron. In 1955, the staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary examined the Soviet historical record and not unexpectedly, in the light of the foregoing statements, came to the following conclusion. The staff studied nearly 1,000 treaties and agreements, both bilateral and multilateral, which the Soviets have entered into not only with the United States, but with countries all over the world. The staff found that in 38 short years since the Soviet Union came into existence, its government has broken its words to virtually every country to which it ever gave a signed promise. It signed treaties of non-aggression with neighboring states and then absorbed those states. It signed promises to refrain from revolutionary activity inside the countries with which it sought friendship, and then cynically broke those promises. It was violating the first agreement it ever signed with the United States at the very moment the Soviet envoy Litvinov was putting his signature to that agreement. And it is still violating the same agreement in 1955. It broke the promises it made to the Western nations during previous meetings at the summit in Tehran and Yalta. It broke Lend-Lease agreements offered to it by the United States in order to keep Stalin from surrendering to the Nazis. It violated the Charter of the United Nations. It kept no international promises at all unless doing so is clearly advantageous to the Soviets. We seriously doubt whether during the whole history of civilization any great nation has ever made as perfidious a record as this in so short a time. More recently, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviets have broken the SALT treaties and used the era of détente to develop an awe-inspiring weapons arsenal. Consequently, the history of the Soviet foreign relations from 1917 to the present suggests, for those who can interpret history, two conclusions. One, the Soviets will not keep their word in any foreign agreement. Two, their intent is self-admittedly aggressive, with world conquest as the ultimate goal. The 1970s era of détente was a sham. Increased U.S.-Soviet trade, allegedly designed to lower tensions, was entirely contrary to historical observation and irrational deduction. Mikhail Suslov, a longtime Russian Communist Party theoretician, stated in 1972 that the U.S.-Soviet détente was temporary and that so far as the Soviet Union is concerned, merely an interlude to gain strength for the next stage of the battle against imperialist aggression. Suslov, in 1972, repeated and reinforced Zinoviev's 1919 statement, "There is no change of heart or direction." Soviet record of aggression. A review of the human cost of Soviet double-dealing emphasizes not only the risk we run by attempts to mellow Soviet statism, but the extreme seriousness of the actions of the deaf, mute, blind men. And every year since the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets have murdered their own citizens for political reasons. That is, for alleged or real opposition to the Soviet state. The AFL-CIO has mapped Soviet forced labor camps. Moreover, in every year since 1917, the Soviets have attacked other countries or interfered massively in their internal affairs. The human cost of the Bolshevik Revolution and the ensuing civil war in Russia has been estimated at 7 million Russians. Between 1930 and 1950, more than 20 million Russians died in forced labor camps. Khrushchev personally supervised the massacre of more than 10,000 Ukrainians at Vinnytsia. Soviet agents were in Spain before the Spanish Civil War of 1936 and unquestionably had some role in starting it, costing 270,000 lives. The supply of Soviet armaments to the Spanish Republic is known from material in the records of the German military attaché at Ankara, Turkey. Soviet arms shipments began in September 1936. Soviet intelligence agents operating in Spain before the war broke out were under General Ulansky, who was also responsible for logistics. In addition to supplies, the Soviets sent 920 military advisors, 70 Air Force Reisers, 100 other officers as early as September 1936, and 750 enlisted men. From September 1936 to March 1938, about 110 shiploads of Russian military supplies left Odessa en route to Spain, almost all from plants built by the deaf-mute blind men, foreshadowing the situation when the USSR supplied Cuba and North Vietnam. Only 32 of the ships were under the Soviet flag, and most of these Soviet flag vessels were foreign-built. These 110 vessels carried the following armaments to Spain from the new Western-built Soviet plants: tanks and armored cars, 731, planes, mostly fighter aircraft, 242, guns, 707, anti-aircraft guns, 27, trucks, 1,386. What was the U.S. technical component of these arms? The tanks sent to Spain in 1936 were based on British Vickers or U.S. Christie designs. Soviet aviation technology was mainly American, except for French Potets and Italian seaplane designs. The guns were Krupp, but the trucks were Ford, Hercules, and Brandt, all from plants built by American firms just 5 years previously. After this, in 1937, Stalin's Red Army purge killed 30,000, the cream of the Soviet military. 2 years later, in 1939, Russia attacked Finland, cost 270,000 Finns and Russians killed. In 1939 to 1940, the Soviets murdered 30,000 Polish officers of Kaizen. Persecution of Russians and other people of Eastern Europe continued after World War II, assisted by British-American Operation Keelhaul. In 1946, the Ukrainians tried unsuccessfully to fight for, independence. Incomplete again. Appendix A, letters with the Department of Defense, 1971. These letters contradict the statements made by William J. Casey, Director of Central Intelligence Agency, that in 1985, the administration had only recently learned of the impact of our technology on the Soviet armaments industry. Washington was alerted 15 years ago. Dr. N. F. Wickner, Special Assistant for Threat Assessment, Director of Defense and Research and Engineering, Department of Defense, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C., 20301. Dear Dr. Wickner, I am in receipt of a letter from the Office of the Director of Defense Research and Engineering, signed Eberhard Rechten, in regard to an inquiry made by me to the Secretary concerning technical information for a projected book, Western Technology in the Soviet Armaments Industry. In response to this letter, which suggests that I should contact you, I enclose A, a list of the information desired, B, a very approximate preliminary outline of the structure of the book. I shall, of course, be more than happy to clarify any points that may arise in consideration of my request. With best wishes, very sincerely, Anthony C. Sutton, Research Fellow. Details of information requested. The information required is as follows. Detailed technical engineering data on Soviet weapon systems from 1945 to date in the form of technical handbooks or reports. Maintenance or servicing handbooks are adequate but less valuable. In Russian or English with diagrammatic layouts, cutaways, technical specifications of materials used, and metallurgical analyses. These are needed for the production models in each weapon series from 1945 to date. For example, medium tanks, data is needed on the T-34, T-54, and T-62, but data is not needed on the development models such as the T-44 or variants of main production models such as the T-34-76B, a turret variant of the main production model T-34. The weapon spectrum for which the range of data is required are the production models of tanks, heavy, medium, light, armored cars, self-propelled guns, trucks and tractor guns of all types, from tank guns down to handguns, ammunition planes, naval craft, rocket launcher, missiles. In other words, the standard models in the broad weapon spectrum. I'm not interested in the more esoteric weapons under development, such as lasers, or weapons developed and abandoned, but only those systems which constitute or have historically constituted the main threat to the free world. B, a detailed listing of the inputs required to manufacture each of the above Soviet weapons, including, if possible, the chemical or physical specifications of material inputs, quantities of inputs per weapon, and model numbers and types of equipment. Categories A and B are required in order to determine how Soviet weapons are manufactured and what material inputs are used. Reports on or raw data on the use by the Soviets of Western technology in weapon systems, and a general military production equipment roster of Soviet armament plants, i.e. their machinery inventories. These will identify use of Western machines. D, reports or raw data on Soviet manufactured propellants, explosives, military clothing, and instrumentation, and computers. The process used, outputs, name of plants. For example, I would like to know the type of explosives produced by the Soviets and either the chemical analysis or sufficient information to determine an approximate analysis. I am not interested in the military aspects, i.e. the explosive force or characteristics of the explosion, only what is being produced and how it is being produced. E, material on the conversions of civilian industrial base to military base, the U.S. experience in World War II and Korea, the problems of conversion time required, ability of civilian plant to military output, adaptability of civilian plant to military output. F, details of the important export control cases, both under the Export Control Act and COCOM in Paris, where DoD has argued against the export of technology or equipment items to the Soviet Union or to other countries where there was possibility of transfer to the USSR. These would include, for example, the Transformatic case of 1961 and the ball bearings case of about the same date, from the mid-50s down to the present time. Equipment lists by model number, not necessarily quantities of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. In general, I am not interested in the qualitative aspects, i.e. how many they have of a particular weapon, nor military characteristics, ballistics, properties, operating characteristics, etc. On the other hand, I am interested in qualitative aspects, particularly knowing how weapons are produced and the material and equipment inputs used to produce these weapons. Whether the weapons and materials produced are military or economically efficient is of little concern for this study. February 18, 1972. Dr. N.F. Wickner, Special Assistant for Threat Assessment, Director of Defense Research and Engineering, Washington, D.C., 20301. Dear Dr. Wickner, this refers to my letter of September the 15th, 1971, concerning my request for technical information on the transfer of technology to the Soviet Union. My understanding is that the department has a suitable database and that according to Mr. Eberhard Rechten's letter of September the 9th, there is a systematic and continuous effort to declassify all pertinent information. Accordingly, I submit with my letter a detailed statement of the information desired. In the absence of any reply or acknowledgement from the department, in the elapsed 5 months, would it now be accurate for me to assume that there is no desire to pursue the question further? Appendix B. Testimony of the author before the Subcommittee 7 of the Platform Committee of the Republican Party at Miami Beach, Florida, August the 15th, 1972 at 2:30 p.m. This appendix contains the testimony presented by the author before the Republican Party National Security Subcommittee at the 1972 Miami Beach Convention. The author's appearance was made under the auspices of the American Conservative Union. The chairman of the subcommittee was Senator John Tower of Texas. Edith Kermit Roosevelt subsequently used this testimony for her syndicated column in such newspapers as the Union Leader, Manchester, New Hampshire. Both major wire services received copies from the American Conservative Union. They were not distributed. Congressman John G. Schmitz then arranged for duplicate copies to be hand-delivered to both UPI and AP. The wire services would not carry the testimony, although the author is an intentionally known academic researcher with 3 books published at Stanford University and forthcoming book from the U.S. Naval Institute. The testimony was later reprinted in Full and Human Events under the title of the Soviet Military-Industrial Complex, and Review of the News under the title of Suppressed Testimony of Anthony C. Sutton. It was also reprinted and extensively distributed throughout the United States by both the American Party and the Libertarian Party during the 1972 election campaign. The following is the text of this testimony as it was originally presented in Miami Beach and made available on UPI and AP. The Soviet military-industrial complex. The information that I'm going to present to you this afternoon is known to the administration. The information is probably not known to Senator from South Dakota or his advisors. And in this instance, ignorance may be a blessing in disguise. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. My job is to give you facts. Whether you like or dislike what I say doesn't concern me. I am here because I believe, and Congressman Ashbrook believes, that the American public should have these facts. I've spent 10 years in research on Soviet technology, what it is, what it can do, and particularly where it came from. I've published 3 books and several articles summarizing the work. It was privately financed, but the results have been available to the government. On the other hand, I have had major difficulties with the U.S. government censorship. I have 15 minutes to tell you about this work. In a few words, there is no such thing as Soviet technology. Almost all, perhaps 90 to 95%, came directly or indirectly from the United States and its allies. In effect, the United States and the NATO countries have built the Soviet Union, its industrial and its military capabilities. This massive construction job has taken 50 years since the revolution in 1917. It has been carried out through trade and the sale of plants, equipment, and technical assistance. Listening to the administration spokesman or some newspaper pundits, you'd get the impression that trade with the Soviet Union is some new miracle cure for the world's problems. That's not quite accurate. The idea that trade with the Soviets might bring peace goes back to 1917. The earliest proposal is dated December 1917, just a few weeks after the start of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was implemented in 1920 while the Bolsheviks were still trying to consolidate their hold on Russia. The result was to guarantee that the Bolsheviks held power. They needed foreign supplies to survive. The history of our construction of the Soviet Union has been blacked out. Much of the key information is still classified, along with the other mistakes of the Washington bureaucracy. Why has the history been blacked out? Because 50 years of dealing with the Soviets has been an economic success for the USSR and a political failure for the United States. It has not stopped war. It has not given us peace. The United States is spending $80 billion a year on defense against an enemy built by the United States and Western Europe. Even stranger, the U.S. apparently wants to make sure this enemy remains in the business of being an enemy. Now, at this point, I've probably lost some of you. What I have said is contrary to everything you've heard from the intellectual elite, the administration, and the business world, and numerous well-regarded senators, just about everyone. Let me bring you back to earth. First, an authentic statement. It's authentic because it was part of the conversation between Stalin and W. Averell Harriman. And Ambassador Harriman has been a prominent in Soviet trade since the 1930s and is an outspoken supporter of yet more trade. This is what Ambassador Harriman reported back to the State Department at the end of World War II. Stalin paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the United States to Soviet industry before and during the war. Stalin said, that about 2/3 of the large industrial enterprises in the Soviet Union has been built with the United States' help or technical assistance. I repeat, 2/3 of all the large industrial enterprises in the Soviet Union have been built with the United States' help or technical assistance. 2/3, 2 out of 3. Stalin could have said that the other 1/3 of large industrial enterprises was built by firms from Germany, France, Britain, and Italy. Stalin could have said that the tank plants, the aircraft plants, explosives and ammunition plants originated in the United States. That was June 1944. The massive technical assistance continues right down to the present day. Now the ability of the Soviet Union to create any kind of military machine, to ship missiles to Cuba, to supply arms to North Vietnam, to supply arms for use against Israel, all this depends on its domestic industry. In the Soviet Union, about 3/4 of the military budget goes on purchases from Soviet factories. This expenditure in Soviet industry makes sense. No army has a machine that churns out tanks. Tanks are made from alloy steel, plastics, rubbers, and so forth. The alloy steel, plastics, and rubber are made in Soviet factories to military specifications, just like in the United States. Missiles are not produced on missile-making machines. Missiles are fabricated from aluminum alloys, stainless steel, electrical wiring, pumps, and so forth. The aluminum, steel, copper wire, and pumps are also made in Soviet factories. In other words, the Soviet military gets its parts and materials from Soviet industry. There is a Soviet military-industrial complex, just as there is an American military-industrial complex. This kind of reasoning makes sense to the man in the street. The farmer in Kansas knows what I mean. The salesman in California knows what I mean. The taxi driver in New York knows what I mean. But the policymakers in Washington do not accept this kind of common-sense reasoning and never have done. So let's take a look at the Soviet industry that provides the parts and the materials for Soviet armaments, the guns, tanks, aircraft. The Soviets have the largest iron and steel plant in the world. That was built by McKee Corporation, as a copy of the U.S. steel plant in Gary, Indiana. All the Soviet Union and steel technology comes from the United States and its allies. The Soviets use open hearth American electric furnaces, American-wide strip mills, Sensor mills, and so on, all developed in the West and shipped as peaceful trade. The Soviets have the largest tube and pipe mill in Europe, 1 million tons a year. This equipment is a Fretz Moon, Salem, Atinia Standard, Mannesman, etc. These are not Russian names. All Soviet tube and pipe making technology comes from the United States and its allies. If you know anyone in the space business, ask them how many miles of tube and pipes go into a missile. The Soviets have the largest merchant marine in the world, about 6,000 ships. I have the specifications for each ship. About 2/3 were built outside the Soviet Union. About 4/5 of the engines for these ships were also built outside the Soviet Union. There are no ship engines of Soviet design. They are built inside the USSR, are built with foreign technical assistance. Bryansk plant makes the largest marine diesels. In 1959, the Bryansk plant made a technical assistance agreement with Brewmeister and Wayne of Copenhagen, Denmark, a NATO ally, approved as peaceful trade by the State Department. The ships that carry Soviet missiles to Cuba 10 years ago used the same Burmeister and Wayne engines. The ships were in the Poltava class. Some have Danish engines made in Denmark, and some have Danish engines made at Bryansk in the Soviet Union. But 100 Soviet ships are used on the Haiphong run to carry Soviet weapons and supplies for Hanoi's annual aggression. I was able to identify 84 of these ships. None of the main engines in these ships were designed and manufactured inside the USSR. All the larger, faster vessels on the Haiphong run were built outside the USSR. All shipbuilding technology in the USSR comes directly or indirectly from the U.S. or its NATO allies. Let's take one industry in more detail, motor vehicles. All Soviet automobile, truck, and engine technology comes from the West, chiefly the United States. In my books, I have listed each Soviet plant, its equipment, and who supplies the equipment. The Soviet military has over 300,000 trucks, all from these U.S.-built plants. Up to the 1968, the largest motor vehicle plant in USSR was at Gorky. Gorky produces many of the trucks American pilots see on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Gorky produced the chassis for the GAZ-69 rocket launcher used against Israel. Gorky produces the Soviet Jeep and half a dozen other military vehicles. And Gorky was built by the Ford Motor Company and the Austin Company as peaceful trade. In 1968, while Gorky was building vehicles to be used in Vietnam and Israel, further equipment for Gorky was ordered and shipped from the U.S. Also in 1968, we have the so-called Fiat deal to build a plant at Volgograd 3 times bigger than Gorky. Dean Rusk and Wade Rostow told Congress and the American public this was peaceful trade. The Fiat plant could not produce military vehicles. Don't let's kid ourselves. Any automobile manufacturing plant can produce military vehicles. I can show anyone who is interested the technical specifications of a proven military vehicle with cross-country capability uses the same capacity engine as a Russian Fiat plant produces. The term Fiat deal is misleading. Fiat in Italy doesn't make automobile manufacturing equipment. Fiat plants in Italy have U.S. equipment. Fiat did send 1,000 men to Russia for erection of the plant, but over half, perhaps well over half of the equipment came from the United States, from Gleason TRW of Cleveland and a new British Machine Co. So in the middle of a war that has killed 46,000 Americans so far, and countless Vietnamese with Soviet weapons and supplies, the Johnson administration doubled Soviet auto output and supplied false information to Congress and the American public. Finally, we get to 1972 under President Nixon. The Soviets are receiving now, today, equipment and technology for the largest heavy truck plant in the world, known as the Kama plant. It will produce 100,000 heavy 10-ton trucks per year. That's more than all U.S. manufacturers put together. This will also be the largest plant in the world, period. It will occupy 36 square miles. Will the Kama truck plant have military potential? The Soviets themselves have answered this one. The Kama truck will be 50% more productive than the ZIL-130 truck. Well, that's nice because the ZIL series trucks are standard Soviet Army trucks used in Vietnam and the Middle East. Who built the ZIL plant? It was built by the Arthur J. Brandt Company of Detroit, Michigan. Who's building the Kama plant? That's classified secret by the Washington policymakers. I don't have to tell you why. Okay, Appendix C. Letters from William C. Norris, chairman of Control Data Corporation, to Congressman Richard T. Hanna, 1973. Control Data Corp, Minneapolis, Minnesota, December 19, 1973. Honorable Richard T. Hanna, Rayburn House Office Building, Washington, D.C. My dear Congressman Hanna, on Wednesday, the December 5th, 1973, testimony was given before the Subcommittee on International Cooperation in Science and Space of the House Science and Astronautics Committee by Mr. Benjamin Schemmer, editor, Armed Forces Journal International. This testimony included the statement that Control Data Corporation has advanced the status of Soviet computer technology by 15 years with the sale of a Control Data 6200 computer. Such a statement regarding transfer of technology to the USSR is simply not factual, and we are prepared to correct that misstatement as well as other incorrect and misleading references to Control Data's activities with the USSR at the pleasure of your committee. Meanwhile, we respectfully request the consideration of the following. We have offered the socialist countries only standard commercial computers, and these offerings have been in full compliance with the export control and administrative directives of the Department of Commerce. The statement regarding a proposed sale of the cyber computer is thoroughly confused. Cyber is a generic name denoting a line of computers. The least powerful model is the Control Data 6200, which is installed at the Dubna nuclear plant facility near Moscow. Another is the Cyber 76, which is the most powerful and appears to be the model Mr. Schemmer is referencing. At the appropriate time, we will seek advisory opinions and submit to the government export license requests for approval of applications in such areas as weather forecasting, simulation, worldwide weather watch program, and econometric modeling and education. Competition from Western Europe and Japan will be expected to address these applications with the same kind of technologies that we offer. Many persons, including some of the witnesses before your committee, mistake the offering for sales of old or even current state-of-the-art hardware for transfer of advanced technology. This is not unusual because in many cases it is difficult for those who are not technically well informed to distinguish advanced computer technology. Attempting to treat such a broad and complex subject as an informative and accurate manner in a brief statement results in inaccurate, unsubstantiated, and misinterpreted inferences and conclusions. For example, it is possible that a computer with a slower algorithmic logic unit and a very large memory may represent a more advanced technology when measured by the size of the problem to be solved than a faster machine with less memory. Also, many mini-computers contain circuit technology more advanced than that of more powerful computers. For this reason, it is not possible to properly respond to Mr. Schemmer's remarks in a short letter. However, the following are examples of those which need to be carefully examined before conclusions are reached. All countries, including the socialists, have a substantial base of computer hardware technology on which to build further advances in the state of the art. The major strength of the U.S. in computer technology is its ability to market superior cost performance computer systems for a wide range of applications. This does not mean that for any given application or round of applications, another country cannot build the equivalent as far as performance is concerned, or even exceed what the United States has available. Also, there is no evidence, to my knowledge, that the USSR has ever been prevented from carrying out a military project because of the lack of adequate computer technology. Further advances in hardware are less significant than our software advances for applying computers. We believe the United States stands to gain significantly from transfer of Soviet knowledge in the basic sciences. The USSR has many more scientists and engineers than we do, and better ones in Russia have concentrated on their theoretical fields, such as chemistry, physics, chemistry, and mathematics, the latter discipline being of particular value in the design of logic and software in the computer field. We respectfully request that your committee review the above points and consider incorporating them into the record. We would be pleased to have the privilege of appearing before your committee to give you more detailed views on these potential relationships with the socialist countries and in stating our reasons in support of administration and congressional trade initiatives and objectives. Sincerely yours, William C. Norris, Chairman of the Board. Oh, let's see. Yeah, okay. Appendix D, letter from Fred Schlafly to friends and supporters of American Council for World Freedom, dated April 1978, asking to mail yellow cards of protest to William Norris. Dear ACWF supporter, I need just a few seconds of your time right now. I need you to sign and mail the 2 postcards I've enclosed for your personal use. Since you're one of the first friends the American Council of World Freedom has, I'm sure I'm not asking too much of you. Please let me explain these 2 postcards and tell you why it's crucial that you sign and mail them today. The yellow postcard is addressed to Mr. William Norris, chairman of the Control Data Corporation, one of the world's biggest and most advanced computer companies. The yellow postcard calls on Mr. Norris and Control Data to stop selling computer technology to communist Russia and its satellites, technology that our communist enemies are using to gain military superiority over the U.S. Once before, Mr. Norris tried to sell our best and most advanced computer to the Soviet Union. Only an all-out last-minute effort by over 300 patriotic congressmen stopped the sale of this highly valuable computer to the Russians. Now, Mr. Norris and Control Data are trying the same sellout to Russia again. You and I have to put a stop to it. And just to make sure that Mr. Norris personally sees your postcard, I have addressed the card to his home address in St. Paul, Minnesota. The blue postcard is addressed to Mr. J. Fred Bucci, president of Texas Instruments. That blue postcard praises Mr. Bucci and Texas Instruments for refusing to sell American technology to our communist allies. You probably know from reading your anti-communist magazines and newspapers that a lot of big U.S. corporations are making huge profits selling their products to communist Russia. Now, I'm not talking about selling products like soft drinks and clothing to the communists. I'm talking about U.S. companies like Control Data that sell our communist enemies computers, shipment equipment, and jet airplanes. Technology that communist Russia is using to turn itself into the world's #1 military superpower. My friend, let me tell you just how critical a problem we really face. There are over 60 big U.S. companies selling U.S. technical secrets to the Soviet Union, companies like Union Carbide, General Electric, Armco Steel, Bryant Chucking Griner, which sells the communists the ball bearings they need for their attack missiles, and Control Data. So why is ACWF only going after Control Data and not those other companies for selling out U.S. military superiority to the communists? The answer is Control Data is absolutely far and away the biggest offender when it comes to selling out U.S. technology and actively aiding the Soviet military power grab. There's no doubt in my mind that if we ACWF supporters force Control Data to stop building the Soviet war machine, then other sellout companies like General Electric and Union Carbide will also stop aiding and abetting our communist enemies. That's why the American Council for World Freedom has set up its task force on strategic trade. Look at what ACWF has already accomplished against Control Data. Just recently, we have a large, enormously successful press conference on Capitol Hill announcing our fight against Control Data's sellout of U.S. computer secrets to the congressmen were there. You might want to look at the enclosed note from the General Daniel Graham, which lists some of the congressmen, newspaper, magazines, and wire services at our press conference. ACWF just published a devastating expose of how Control Data and other sellout companies are turning America into a second-rate power by helping build the Soviet war machine. We gave each reporter and congressman at our peace conference a copy of our study, The Strategic Dimension of East-West Trade, by Dr. Miles Kostick, one of America's top experts on foreign affairs and strategic trade. ACWF is off to a fast start against controlled data, but there's no use kidding ourselves. We've got a big fight ahead of us. Here's what needs to be done right away. One, we've got to flood control data and its chairman, Mr. William Norris, with postcards and letters demanding no more U.S. help for the Soviet war machine. You could help to do that by signing and mailing your postcards to Mr. Norris today. Two, we've got to support and encourage companies like Texas Instruments when they show the guts and have the backbone to say no to communist Russia. Will you help do that by mailing your postcard to Mr. Fred Bucci, president of Texas Instruments, today? We've got to print and distribute 28,959 copies of Dr. Kostick's brilliant expose, The Strategic Dimension of East-West Trade. We must get this exposed into the hands of America's 10,286 newspaper editors, 9,414 magazine editors, 9,309 TV and radio news editors. And finally, we've got to write to tens of thousands of other Americans, 50,000 in May alone, alerting them to control data and similar sellouts of America's scientific secrets, getting them active in ACWF's fight to keep America the #1 military on earth. I don't have to tell you that I'm talking about an aggressive, expansive program. It will cost $28,090 to print 28,959 copies of ACWF's control data expose and distribute them to 28,959 newspapers, magazines, radio, TV editors. And it will cost $13,253 to write 50,000 Americans in May. It's a total of 41,343 ACWF urgency needs. We simply don't have it. Will you help ACWF again with as generous a gift as you can afford? What I'm asking you for is contribution before May 15th, or at least $25, but hopefully more, perhaps even $50, $100, $250, $500, or $1,000 if you can afford it. I know I ask an awful lot of you, but I don't have anyone else to turn to. So please, when you mail your 2 postcards, won't you use the envelope reply? Once you use the enclosed reply envelope to rush ACWF your support of $25, $50, $100, $250, $500, or $1,000. Gratefully, Fred Schlafly. P.S. Remember, when you mail that yellow postcard protesting Control Data's military sellout of the U.S. to Russia, your card will be read by Control Data boss William Norris because it's addressed to his home. All right, everyone, that's all we have for tonight. Make sure to tune in next week for the final episode, it looks like, of the best enemy money can buy. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.